Hey, Matt Thomas here again. This is part 2 in a 2-part introduction to AJAX. And if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I recommend that you check that out first so you can get an understanding of how AJAX works and so you can get caught up to speed on what we're trying to achieve here. So I've got several files here that I want you to look at. I've got ajax.html, which holds the markup that's actually going to display our data on the web page. It's the actual HTML file. I've got an external JavaScript file here that's actually going to hold our AJAX script, and I've pre-commented it so that you'll be able to pause the video if you want and read the comments so you can see what each block of code is trying to achieve. And then I have an external text file here that holds the data that we're going to retrieve with AJAX. And this data is just a simple text string. It's a simple string that we're going to pass over to the HTML file. So why don't we get started writing the code? So the first thing we need to do is we need to declare a variable. We're going to call it XML HTTP request object. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that because I'm going to be reusing this a lot rather than typing it all out. I'm going to set it equal to false. And we need to set it equal to false so that later in the script can check to see if it was indeed created, so that it can have something to match against. So the next thing we need to do is create some conditional logic that checks whether or not pretty much checks whether or not the user is using Internet Explorer 6 or if he's using a browser that's standards compliant, that actually uses the XML HTTP request object. And I'll explain that more in a second. Typos today. Okay, let's see what we have so far. Now, like I said, it's conditional logic. If the XML HTTP request method of the window object exists, then we're going to set the variable to a new XML HTTP request object. If the ActiveX object of the window object exists, then we're going to set our variable that we created up here equal to a new ActiveX object. And this only goes for Internet Explorer 6 because Microsoft, once again, wanted to do its own thing and create its own proprietary XML HTTP request object. But I think that they fixed that in Internet Explorer 7. So we just have to worry about it for maybe a couple more years until IE 6 phases out. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually create the function that's going to get the data. And it's going to have 2 arguments. So let's go ahead and do that. Function, we're going to call it getData, and we're going to pass it 2 arguments, data source and div ID. Okay. Next thing we need to do is the first thing we need to do inside the function is check to see, like I said, if the XML HTTP request object exists, if it was set to in the variable. So let's go ahead and do that. And if it was, then we need to go ahead and create a variable. We're going to call it obj, short for object. And we're going to use the getElentById method. It's a method of the document object. And remember I was telling you before, we're going to manipulate the document object model, and this is how we're doing it. We're going to target the div, which has an ID that it's going to get passed from the HTML file to update with the new data. So we set our variable, and now we need to use the open method of the XML HTTP request object to actually get the data. And we're going to use the get method, and we need to use the data source argument. This is the URL to where the text file is stored. It's getting passed here, in here. Save what we have so far. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to assign an anonymous function to the onReady state change property of the XML HTTP request object. I'm just going to keep saying it over and over. This is called assigning an anonymous function. And we need to do some conditional logic in here as well. We need to see if two properties have been satisfied. We need to check the ready state, and I'll go into detail about this in a second. See, make sure that it's equal to 4. That means everything has been completed. And then we need to check the status. Don't worry about the line breaks, just pretend it's one line of code. We need to make sure that it's equal to 200. That means everything is okay. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, let's go over and look at this file that I've prepared. The ready state property values, there's 4 possible values: uninitialized, loading, loaded, interactive, and complete. And 4 means complete. That means the data has been retrieved, it's been downloaded. The status property values, a little similar, but not quite. 200 means okay. That means the data was downloaded, everything went well, and it's ready. Everything's ready. You'll notice that there are other status property values. 404, I'm sure you're familiar with. That means that the page, wasn't found. It doesn't exist in the web server. So this is a status property value. So let's exit out of this. We don't need this anymore. Let's go back to here. Okay. So if these conditions are met, we're going to go ahead and assign the inner HTML, which is another document object model property, of that div. And this is just a way of saying the text that's inside that div, the inner HTML. It needs to be equal to the response text, which is another property of the XML HTTP request object. Now, remember I said we're not using XML, we're using text. If we were using XML, we'd have to pass this XML, but we're not. We're using text. Let's see what we have so far, and let's move on. And then finally, the last thing we have to do, let's go ahead and close this and close the if statement. Last thing we have to do is actually use the send method and send the data. And we have to give it a value of null, because we're not returning anything, we're just sending data, and it gets sent. So we're going to close anonymous function and close our custom function. And so that's about it. Let's go ahead and see if this works in our browser. It should. I'm going to reload the page. This is the text that's currently in the HTML file. And if I hit the Get Data button, it retrieved the text from the text file without having to reload the browser. And that's pretty much the basics of AJAX. Manipulating all these different properties and methods to update data on the page without having to reload. Once again, we're using the document object model to achieve that. I hope that you've learned something from this, and stay tuned for more advanced AJAX tutorials in the future.